Bishop Ryle. I think we've got some back there. But
I
my
could
point
quote
is
other
that,
Anglican bishops, but that's okay.
Okay. Well, we could talk about Lightfoot and some others. But the point is that there is absolutely no reason why a recognition of their technological level means that what they spoke does not come from God. That is the fundamental difference between us. Is I believe that God can communicate through his creatures in such a way that his communication remains valid to this day, and the history of the Christian church is of interpretation of that scripture in such a way that allows for my position. I don't believe that abuses, as I've said, of reading text of scripture means that that was what was forced by exegesis. Most of the time, it is ignoring the exegesis of the text of scripture that led to those abuses of scripture. I think you'd have to agree with me.
No, don't.
That solid exegesis in context would have led to a different understanding if tradition had not gotten in the way.
I think that there's a presupposition that you're making that would make that almost impossible. And it's not just technological. You know, I find in the biblical story that slavery is thought of as an acceptable institution. It's not to me. I can quote Old Testament and New Testament.
May I respond to that?
You may respond. Let me finish asking the question. I find the behavior of so much of the biblical story in treating women as second-class citizens, which continued to manifest itself in this country until relatively recently, probably still does. In 1874, a woman was denied the right to practice law in the state of Illinois because, according to the majority opinion, God had created the woman for the more domestic role. Now, that's the heritage that I think we've had, and I find that that is behavior, and I think it diminishes 50% of the human race, and I'm embarrassed that I've been a part of a movement that has diminished women, including my daughters and my wife and my mother, the way Christianity has diminished women. And I'd say the same thing about people of color, and today I think the battle is simply about people who are different in their sexual orientation. So I don't accept even the premise of what you're suggesting, that within the biblical story is some objective reality.
That does seem to be the difference between us, but there is logically no connection between the condemnation of homosexuality, the reality that slavery existed in the ancient world, and the scriptures recognizing that did not overthrow the entirety of the economic system of the day, throwing everybody into chaos, but regulated it and did so in a humane fashion.
So
that has nothing. I've allowed for questions that are 10 minutes in length. Please allow me to at least have a few moments to respond to them.
Okay.
There is likewise, when we look at what the scriptures state about women, in comparison to the context in which it was stated, it is amazing. The Genesis account, made in the image of God. And that's why I said, if the entirety of the text of Scripture had been taken into account, Ephesians 5 had been taken into account, husbands are to love their wives as Christ loved the church, if true exegesis had taken place, the Bible could never be used to attack women, but only to elevate them. But as I said in one of my previous statements, being thrown in here is the idea of some sort of egalitarianism that is unbiblical, that does not recognize the difference between men and women, and that's not the same thing as quote-unquote oppression or suppression. So if we would use language accurately, then I submit to you there is no reason for any modern person today to reject what the scriptures say as having relevance to us today, because if we would apply sound rules of exegesis to them, they would not be able to be used in this abusive fashion that was just cited.
That's not the history of the Christian tradition, however. And let me suggest that I grew up in the South. I'm glad you grew up in Minnesota. Is that where it was? I grew up in the South, so I know the scourge of slavery and segregation and what it's done to people of color. And we used to argue that we could have separate but equal. My friends, it was always separate. It was never equal. Women have been defined in the Scriptures, even in the Ten Commandments, as inferior to men, as even the property of men. The 10th Commandment says you shall not covet your neighbor's wife nor his ox. It's clear that your neighbor's a male, and that the wife is part of the property along with the ox and the ass and the other male possessions. I think that's abominable, and I think that there has been an increasing consciousness. You have said earlier that it's technological. I think there's an expanding consciousness. I don't think it'd be possible for 21st century people to enslave people of color again. I don't think it's possible for men to force women into second-class positions again. And it will not be very long before it will not be possible for the heterosexual majority to oppress the homosexual majority by their own prejudiced definitions.
Well, sir, a number of things. First of all, you mentioned the Ten Commandments. It's the Ten Commandments that says you shall not commit adultery. It's the Ten Commandments that protects the relationship of man and woman in marriage. And that even comes after the point in time that Jesus cites in Matthew chapter 19 that talks about them becoming one flesh. We again have to take Scripture and tear it into little pieces and interpret it in a worldview utterly foreign to its writers to be able to come up with that conclusion. You just talked about slavery again, even though that's not our issue today, and yet you continue to parallel that with homosexuality. There is no parallel between these two things. The slavery issue goes to today how employers should treat their employees. There is no parallel to the concept of homosexuality unless you assume a perspective that seems to me to be going out of style in the homosexual community, and it seems to me that you hold a view of homosexuality it's about 20 years out of date now, that makes it completely a matter of genetics, and yet the homosexual community itself is recognized.
I've never suggested that.
That it's natural, that you're simply, well, if it's left-handed and red-haired and freckled, if that's not genetic, what is it?
No, it's not genetic. The doctors I worked with at the Cornell Medical Center would reject the genetic possibility. They'd also reject the environmental possibility. They just think that's the way life is.
That's the way it is, a brute fact.
That's the way it is, and they would justify that with all of their history. But let me respond to your commandment thing. Yes, the seventh commandment does say you shall not commit adultery. But what we don't realize is that when that commandment was given, polygamy was the style of marriage. It was some 300 years after Moses was supposed to receive the Ten Commandments from God on Mount Sinai that Solomon had 1,000 wives. Now help me to understand what adultery means when one man owns 1,000 women. If you have 1,000 wives and still have some need to commit adultery, I think you've got a problem. I think you've got a huge problem. I don't even think it's a moral problem. I think it's a problem of your being. So I think to use the Scriptures this way is simply an inappropriate way to address contemporary issues.
But, sir, if you allow the Scriptures to speak for themselves, that commandment comes before Solomon and explains why Solomon's heart is turned away from God, does it not?
Well, that again gets you back into a dating problem. We think, most scholars think, I guess that's where we begin to quote authorities, and I don't think that's very helpful, but the bulk of Old Testament scholars would say that the Moses story is written, sometime well after Moses' death, so that it's probably written during the reign of King Solomon. The actual writing of the Ten Commandments probably came around 940, 950 in the reign of King Solomon with his 1,000 wives. And I just think you've got to be careful about how you don't isolate Scripture from